Thanks everyone for joining us today for this Ask Me Anything webinar regarding hybrid cloud. Your lines are on mute, but you can enter in questions for this session using either the chat function, which is in the very bottom of the GoToWebinar control panel that you'll see on your screen, or you can also use the question feature to send in a question. I will give you just a brief introduction of Greenhouse Data. We are headquartered in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and we've been in business since 2007. We have facilities in Cheyenne, Seattle, Washington, Bellingham and Everett, Washington, Portland, Oregon, Piscataway, New Jersey, and Orangeburg, New York. We are very process-driven and fully compliant, including HIPAA compliance and SSAE 16 Type 2. We're a VMware service provider. We are 100% powered by sustainable wind energy, and we're the first B Corp in Wyoming, and we offer 24/7 live customer support. Just to reiterate, we do have data center locations across the United States where we service cloud and co-location. We offer cloud hosting, co-location, managed services, and again, a high level of customer support out of all of those locations. And our presenter today is Stephen Dreher, who is our Director of Solutions Architecture. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Stephen, and if you want to give just a brief introduction, and then we can get into some of the questions that people pre-submitted. And again, for folks on the line, if you'd like to ask a live question, put it down in the chat window or use the Ask a Question feature, and I'll send you a chat so you can see it if it's not already showing up on your screen. Stephen?
Thank you, Wendy. As Wendy had mentioned, my name is Stephen Dreher, and I'm the Director of Solutions Architecture for Greenhouse Data. Before coming to Greenhouse Data, I worked in the public space for just over 14 years, culminating as the Chief Technology Officer to a branch of government. I was the Chief Technology Officer for about 8 years. And during that time, I oversaw that organization go through dramatic changes with technology, including paperless initiatives, uniform record keeping, integrating life cycles with other organizations, operational continuity, and even video conferencing. In my role at Greenhouse Data, I'm a problem solver on behalf of clients wishing to pursue or expand operational strategies where cloud and infrastructure play a key part.
Great, thank you. So, Stephen, one of the questions that came through in pre-registration is this idea of why use a hybrid cloud in the first place? And perhaps as you're addressing that, maybe you can just define a little bit by what we talk about when we talk about hybrid cloud.
Absolutely. The term hybrid is a cloud computing model that is a blend of private and third-party cloud environments that function as a single environment. Let me expand on that a little bit. Typically what one will see is an organization that has maintained a traditional IT space either on-premise or typically it is on-premise, and that's obviously a private cloud. A public cloud is that of which is run on behalf of by a third-party provider such as Greenhouse Data. And so the question of why use a hybrid cloud in the first place? And the reasons here are actually quite numerous, but I'll toss out a couple that come to mind, and then I'll expand on that a little bit. One of the first things that comes to mind is scalability. And typically when we think of scalability, we think about an IT infrastructure that is either expanding or contracting, or it's evolving or it's devolving. And using a hybrid cloud, one is able to essentially take up that slack and leverage the resources in that third-party environment. Another use case for a hybrid cloud is low-cost operational resiliency. And a textbook example of that would be disaster recovery. So for example, if I maintain my own internal infrastructure, I have perhaps only one facility to do so. Using a hybrid cloud model, I would be able to expand into a third-party provider and be able to essentially bridge that gap so that my information and my processes, for that matter, my operations, if you will, are not subject to any sort of risks associated with one facility. Another classic use case for hybrid cloud is what I like to think of as high-performance service. And then that would be offloading of that service. And here's a good example. Say I have a process or information that is very seasonal or peak in nature. That could be a time of day, it could be a time of year, it could be anything that basically creates a spike on my operational IT environment. Being able to offload that service into a third-party provider via a hybrid cloud model allows me to actually not have to procure additional hardware, not have to procure additional software, which of course has a management overhead associated with maintaining that. It's only used for a certain select amount of time, and so I essentially have burstability built into my operational model at that point. Another key element of hybrid cloud is it's a development platform. If I'm an organization that maintains a development staff in-house, that staff needs to have access to computing resources in order to be able to function or do their jobs. And that, of course, could mean additional expenses, both at hardware and, again, the management perspective of maintaining those resources for development. And so what we can typically see is a third-party provider is brought in specifically for development. It's kind of a test environment. Again, it can capitalize on the scalability to be able to ramp up and ramp down as needed, or very elastic at that moment. And it's very handy for developers. And then, of course, it can also lead into production environments, etc. Another key use case is security. And security is a very broad term. And when I start thinking about security, I'm looking at being able to leverage much larger organizations that have greater depth of resources in order to be able to address security. And as a client, I'm able to capitalize on that at a price point and an expertise point as well to be able to address security pain points. And the last reason that comes to mind is managed service availability. And simply speaking, what managed services are the ability to outsource the care and feeding of IT infrastructure at that point. So again, it's a means to be able to cut costs and reduce workload on existing IT staff by augmenting that with a third-party provider.
Great, thank you. Stephen, in a hybrid model, do you see any risks in terms of data sovereignty as information goes off of a client or an organization's premise?
That's actually a really good question, Wendy. Typically, you and I think of data sovereignty meaning that data is subject to the laws of the country where it resides. And however, that may not always be the case, particularly when dealing with multinational organizations. And I think this is probably best described by using an example. If I'm a Canadian company using a data center in Canada operated by a US-based company to host my data, that data located in Canada is subjected to the US Patriot Act, and it could be accessed without my permission. So to answer the question, yes, there are risks when it comes to data sovereignty. However, there are ways to mitigate those risks, the large one being encryption, particularly encryption of data at rest. That meaning that if I am hosting data, even in a third-party provider in another country, as long as that data is inaccessible in its raw form, that risk is mitigated. One last thing as it applies to data sovereignty that comes to mind is it's important to know that a lot of countries, particularly more and more, are taking an aggressive posture on data sovereignty in order to protect their citizens from personal information breaches. And it's unfortunate because there's all too many cases in the media that basically say this so-and-so organization was compromised, patient data or other sensitive material was crossing other borders, it was infiltrated at that point. And so countries are really starting to take the issue of data sovereignty. And again, that does pose certain risks. It's important to do the research to be able to navigate that successfully.
Great. One person said, I'm actually looking for some reasons not to go to the cloud. Our executives like it, but I don't think it makes sense for us, and they noted that they're a hospital.
Okay. Essentially, so this is one of the tricky spots when we start actually looking at a cloud strategy as part of an organizational strategy. And specifically as it relates to a hospital or anything in healthcare, what we're really talking about is the protecting of patient data or PHI, personal health information. And this is where compliance plays a very large role. Let me put it this way. If consideration is being given to a service provider that is not HIPAA compliant, that would be a reason not to go to the cloud. That being said, other reasons are somewhat more vanilla, such as maybe lack of budgetary or having some sort of a fiscal constraint attached. But I do have to say that I see cloud playing a part in virtually every organization's operations at some point. The reasons are simply too numerous when we start thinking of operational continuity, and disaster recovery. One last thing I would note is if I'm looking at an organization that actually prefers to allocate their costs using a CapEx model instead of an operational expense model or an OpEx model, that could potentially be a reason where the cloud may not necessarily be a good fit.
Okay, good. And I think just kind of touching on that too, what type of security management issues do you see people needing to be aware of as you extend an existing data center into a hybrid environment?
That's a great question. Again, I would have to say that compliance plays a very large role here. We need not to just consider the information compliance such as HIPAA or PCI, but also facility compliance. Wendy, I think you touched on it a little bit earlier in the call where SSAE 16 type 2 typically comes up. And what that pretty much means is that data center providers are subject to internal processes and protocols as well in order to be able to offer assurances that client data is safe. And those protocols and that compliance level gets right down into even the perimeter of the building, who has access to even get in the building, who has access to the data center white space, even down to the cabinet level. And when I say cabinet, I mean like the physical rack levels that you would see in a traditional facility. Other potential factors of security include having to adapt the internal security policies of any organization to be inclusive of the third-party providers and the data itself kind of playing a role in that. One of the things that comes to mind is protecting data in transit. Now, using a hybrid cloud, typically what can happen is the connectivity happens in one of two methods. Either the normal internet is utilized through either VPNs or some other strategy, or a point-to-point connection is put into place. The point that I was trying to make is that encryption needs to be considered for anything that's going across the internet. And although that seems somewhat intuitive from an IT perspective, that may not necessarily be the true for a perspective that goes beyond the IT office into, say, the management chain.
Okay. And also, can you describe this concept of data in transit and data at rest?
Absolutely. So when we talk about data, it has one of two forms, and data in transit basically means that when the data is moving from point A to point B, is it in clear text? Is it something that can be essentially lifted up from the wire or listened in upon, or some other factor where the data that's in motion has a risk associated to it? Data at rest, however, means that when data is not being transmitted, it has to reside someplace. Typically, we think of this as like a storage area network, or it could be any kind of a storage platform. And how data is presented at that level is what's considered data at rest.
Great, thanks. A question that just came through. So as a company might look towards moving to a hybrid cloud model, what type of tools are there to automate resources so that IT departments aren't on the hook for building everything? What type of work is there involved in terms of tying together APIs? Perhaps just discuss process and tools a little bit.
Yeah, I certainly can. So the tools are numerous. Essentially, when one is looking to pursue into a hybrid cloud environment, it really depends on the nature of the environment that it's coming from as well, and what that direction looks like, what the customer is trying to accomplish, in other words. That could include being able to set up various replication technologies, so essentially being able to move resources from the on-premise environment up into the hybrid cloud environment seamlessly and automated. So you can think of that kind of in the context of disaster recovery, where resources are always kept at the same point in time in both locations if it's in a DR context. But that could also include being able to provision new resources. And depending on the cloud provider, the tools could be something such like VMware Director, vCloud Director as we like to call it, where an individual would be able to actually go in, provision resources just like they were sitting in their local on-premise data center. They can do that in the cloud as well. And so a lot of times that's addressed as like a single pane of glass, or being able to actually manage the infrastructure and the compute environment remotely. So that would be another example of that. If one is looking to pursue going from, say, a physical server in the private environment to a hybrid cloud environment, there are additional tools available. Again, it typically happens through replication, but that would be another example where that resource would essentially be duplicated over time, and then a cutover date is established. And lastly, there's the old-fashioned method where essentially we move data by physically moving either an external hard drive or some other resource. If you're dealing with a large quantity of data, you typically see this more often, where a copy is made, it's simply brought to a facility at the third-party location, and then that data is then imported into the cloud at that point. So the tools I would summarize as there's the automatic kind through replication. There is the import and export kind. It can also be something like a flat file and/or including all of the large scale. We like to call it truck it down an interstate method, where you essentially basically plug it in and then import it that way in a bulk fashion.
Okay, great. What happens if cloud resources are unavailable and it's a peak processing period?
That's a great question. So typically what you'll see is cloud resources need to be provisioned, and that provisioning typically happens via either a contract or a service level agreement or something of that nature. And depending on that agreement, most cloud providers have enough resources available that would be able to burst. And what I mean by burst is that these resources would be available as needed, beyond that threshold, and then being able to tap into that extra little bit, if you would, just for that short duration of time.
Okay, good.
Question.
We're actually right now are just down to one final question here, which is hypervisors. Do you have an opinion? VMware, OpenStack, Hyper-V?
Actually, that is again, that's another good question. Each one has its own strengths and weaknesses. For example, VMware and Hyper-V combine all of the key components of virtualization, which is a key technology when we start looking at the cloud in general. But those two actually, they wrap them all up under one supported product, whereas OpenStack actually uses a combination of different products to be able to create that stack. For example, the OpenStack uses a Nova for computation. It uses a product called Neutron for network storage, and Swift and/or Cinder for storage operations. Swift is for the object-based, and Cinder is for block-based storage. And the caveat being is sometimes these extra pieces each require management on their own, which can turn into additional management overhead, etc. Another thing to consider is that VMware doesn't natively support an object storage platform like OpenStack does. However, in the VM context, you can actually run an OpenStack basically resource to be able to provision object level storage. A strength of Hyper-V is that it's included in all current Windows Server versions for free, and so there's an accessibility issue there, a convenience, if you will. But by and large, I would have to say that my personal preference happens to be the VMware, simply because it is geared towards this level of computing that's enterprise, and that gets into the automatic provisioning of resources. Wendy, you had mentioned earlier about APIs, and let me expand on that just a second. So when I start looking at automatic provisioning, and it's called vRealize, say to address that peak issue that had come up before during the computation cycle, maybe it's some sort of a burstable workload, there is the ability for the cloud environment to actually automatically scale to provision additional resources when they're needed. A good example of that, using that prior example, when we run out of resources, the environment itself can scale up another web server or another application server, or be able to even do that with a database cluster as well to be able to handle that peak utilization. And in the same fashion that it is ramping up, it can also scale back down automatically as well. But kind of jumped around a little bit there, Wendy, but my preference happens to be VMware, simply for the ability to do not only the automated components that I just mentioned, but also it has some very granular report metrics that come in there as well. And reporting becomes critical from an optimization standpoint. If I'd like to know how my computation environment is doing or what it is doing, I can identify peak utilization, where resources get thin, etc., and then be able to reprovision or adjust accordingly to be able to navigate around that.
Okay, great. And so what do you see organizations needing to do as they're evaluating applications for being cloud ready? Virtualization's become pretty ubiquitous in a lot of IT organizations, but there are other pieces of it: network, compute, migration. What do you see people needing to look at as they look at a migration path for a provider in a hybrid cloud context?
The simple answer is that anything that can be run on what I would consider to be a traditional environment, and I'm always mindful that virtualization is it's gaining presence even in a lot of private organizations as well as third-party providers. And so if an application is running, say, on a standard Windows environment, that environment should have no barriers to entry in a cloud environment. Everything should function exactly the same. There should be very little in the part of looking at an application readiness context to be able to say, well, there's an issue here, we need to be able to adapt it to a cloud. There really isn't a whole heck of a lot of that's necessary. I would say that their attention does need to always be given to infrastructure in particular, making sure that networks are configured correctly, that the application behavior is performing as expected, and being able to address any pain points that may arise from that.
Great. That is all of the questions that came through. Any final thoughts?
You know, Wendy, I have to tell you that my last final thought is that it goes back to something else that I had mentioned earlier, and that is that it was the question that was the reasons not to go to cloud. And one of the things that when dealing with that decision, if you will, is to start small. Look at it from a perspective of maybe I'm an organization that doesn't have a secondary offsite for just my data. I do my weeklies and I do my monthlies and my yearlies. However, I don't have that data off-site. Maybe I'm bringing a tape home once a week, etc. Envision looking at a hybrid cloud environment as a way to offset just starting small and looking for other opportunities as one goes along, because I think that once the toe is in the water, that a lot of things will actually come out.
Wonderful. Thank you. Stephen, thank you so much, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Appreciate the questions. We're wrapping up a little bit early here, but you've got 6 minutes